Francesca Blake slammed the car door shut, her breath coming in short, frustrated bursts as she gazed up at the rustic cabin in the middle of nowhere. The cold mountain air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed it. Anything was better than the suffocating heat of flashing cameras and relentless questions back in New York. She yanked her coat tighter around her body and grabbed her suitcase from the trunk. A week. That's all she needed, just 1 week, to let the media frenzy die down before she returned to clean up the mess her ex-business partner had made. The betrayal still burned, but she refused to be seen as weak. Francesca Blake was the CEO of one of the most powerful fashion empires in the country, and she didn't run from anything. Except, apparently, from the press. She stomped up the cabin steps and unlocked the door. The inside was cozy wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. It wasn't her usual 5-star suite, but she didn't care. She needed quiet. Francesca set her suitcase down and shivered. The cold seeped into her bones and the fireplace sat dark and lifeless. She frowned and flipped the switch on the thermostat. Nothing. Perfect. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed the rental agreement and scanned through the emergency contact list. She found a name, Callum Hayes, local handyman, and dialed the number. After 3 rings, a deep, rugged voice answered. "Yeah, this is Francesca Blake. I rented the cabin on Hollow Pine Road. The fireplace isn't working and it's freezing in here." There was a pause before the man sighed. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She hung up and rubbed her arms, pacing the small living room. The last thing she needed was to deal with some gruff, small-town repairman, but she had no choice. 15 minutes later, a knock sounded at the door. She yanked it open, ready to demand why he was late, but the words caught in her throat. The man standing before her looked like he belonged on the cover of an outdoorsman magazine. Tall, broad-shouldered, with messy dark blonde hair and piercing green eyes. His flannel shirt stretched over his muscular arms, and there were faint smudges of soot on his hands. "Callum Hayes," he said, his voice low and steady. "You got a fireplace problem." Francesca blinked, forcing herself to regain composure. "Yes." "It won't turn on, and the thermostat isn't working either." He stepped inside, his presence making the cabin feel even smaller. The scent of pine and firewood clung to him as he crossed the room and crouched by the fireplace. "Pilot lights out," he muttered, grabbing a few tools from the bag slung over his shoulder. "Shouldn't take long." She folded her arms, watching as he worked. "Are you the only handyman in town?" He chuckled, the sound deep and rich. "Pretty much." "Small town." She nodded, unsure what else to say. He didn't seem impressed by her presence, which was a first. Most men either fawned over her or recoiled at the idea of a powerful woman. Callum did neither. A few minutes later, the fireplace roared to life, bathing the room in a warm, flickering glow. Callum stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "Should be good now." Francesca held her hands out toward the fire, sighing in relief. "Thank you." He nodded, but instead of leaving, he glanced around the cabin. "You here alone?" She arched a brow. "Why?" "Storm's coming," he said simply. "If the power goes out, you'll need more than just the fireplace. You got extra blankets." "Flashlights?" Francesca hesitated. She hadn't exactly packed for survival. Luxury coats and designer gloves. "Yes, emergency supplies, not so much." Callum sighed, clearly reading her expression. "I'll bring some over later, just in case." Before she could argue, he was already heading for the door. "Wait," she called. He turned, one brow raised. She hesitated, then cleared her throat. "I appreciate it." His lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile. "See you later, Francesca." Then he was gone, leaving her standing in the warm glow of the fire, wondering why her heart was beating just a little too fast. Francesca had spent her life in control. Every detail of her day meticulously planned, every decision carefully calculated. But as she stood in the cabin's small kitchen, staring out at the thick snowflakes swirling beyond the window, she felt completely at the mercy of forces she couldn't command. The storm had come faster than expected, blanketing the landscape in an unforgiving layer of white. She tightened the belt of her cashmere robe and turned away from the window. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The power had flickered once, but so far it held. Still, the silence pressed in on her. In the city, she was surrounded by the hum of life, cars, conversation, the ever-present rhythm of New York. Here, the quiet was almost deafening. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She hesitated before pulling it open, revealing Callum standing on the porch, a bundle of blankets in his arms. Snow clung to his shoulders, his boots leaving deep imprints in the fresh powder. "Brought these in case you need them," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Francesca watched as he set the blankets on the couch, then unzipped his coat and shook the snow from his collar. His presence filled the space effortlessly, his movements efficient and unbothered. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, crossing her arms. He glanced at her, unreadable. "Storm's worse than I thought. Roads are already bad. If the power goes out, you'll need more than just the fireplace." She exhaled slowly. She didn't like feeling helpless, and she certainly didn't enjoy the idea of relying on a man she barely knew. But Callum wasn't hovering. He wasn't offering help for the sake of it, he was just doing what needed to be done. She gestured toward the couch. "I appreciate it." He nodded, but instead of heading for the door, he studied her for a beat. "You look restless." She blinked. "I'm not used to doing nothing." Figured. He moved to the fireplace, adjusting the logs. "You're the type that always has to be working." Her jaw tightened. "And what type are you?" He didn't answer immediately. "The kind that knows when to step back." Francesca wasn't sure if that was a dig at her or just a simple truth. Either way, it unsettled her. She leaned against the counter, watching him. "You don't ask a lot of questions." "I don't need to." That should have been frustrating, but instead she found herself intrigued. Most people pried, especially when they recognized her name, but Callum didn't seem interested in her wealth or her scandal. He wasn't impressed or intimidated. He straightened, brushing his hands together. "You eaten yet?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so caught up in escaping the media storm, she hadn't thought much about food. "I know, not yet," she admitted. Callum pulled off his gloves and set them on the table. "I've got stew back at my place, plenty to share." She hesitated. "I'm not in the habit of accepting dinner invitations from strangers." A flicker of something amusement maybe passed through his eyes. "Not an invitation, just an offer. You can stay here and eat whatever you brought, or you can have something warm." The choice was clear. She hadn't packed much in terms of groceries, and the thought of another protein bar made her stomach turn. "Fine," she said, grabbing her coat. "But I'm driving myself." Callum didn't argue, just pulled his own coat back on and stepped outside. The drive to his place was only a few minutes, but the snow made it treacherous. By the time she pulled into his driveway, her knuckles were tight around the wheel. His house was modest, a sturdy two-story place with smoke curling from the chimney. Warm light spilled from the windows, making the snow outside seem even colder. Inside, the scent of something rich and savory greeted her. The space was simple but lived in worn leather furniture, shelves lined with books, a few framed photos on the mantel. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, curated perfection of her Manhattan penthouse. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 bowls of steaming stew. Francesca accepted hers cautiously, unsure of the last time someone had cooked for her. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the occasional clink of a spoon against the bowl. "You always live out here?" she asked eventually. "Moved back a few years ago." She waited for more, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he asked, "You always run when things get messy?" The question made her stiffen. "I didn't run." His gaze was steady. "You're here." She set her spoon down, irritation flaring. "I needed space." "Fair enough." He leaned back in his chair, studying her, "But space won't fix what's broken." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. She stood, pushing her chair back. "Thank you for dinner." Callum didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded. Drive safe. She left feeling more unsettled than when she arrived. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had seen right through her. By the time Francesca pulled back into the cabin's driveway, the snowfall had thickened into a relentless white curtain. The headlights of her car barely cut through the flurry, and the wind howled against the trees, shaking their snow-laden branches. She stepped out cautiously, her boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. The storm had escalated. She made it inside just as another powerful gust rattled the windows. Locking the door behind her, she exhaled slowly, rubbing her hands together for warmth even though the fire still burned steadily. Her mind wasn't on the cold, it was on Callum. More specifically, on the way he had looked at her. Not with awe or judgment, but with something more piercing, something that made her feel exposed despite all the carefully built defenses she had spent years perfecting. She didn't like it. Francesca wasn't used to being read so easily, let alone by a man who seemed to have no interest in her power, her wealth, or the scandal she was currently buried under. He was unreadable, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Determined to shake him from her thoughts, she grabbed the nearest blanket and curled up on the couch, forcing herself to focus on the fire's flickering glow. Yet despite her best efforts, sleep was restless, filled with visions of green eyes watching her too closely, of steady hands fixing broken things. Somewhere in the night the storm reached its peak. The wind roared like an angry beast, and then darkness. The sudden silence woke her. She sat up abruptly, her breath visible in the cold air. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was eerily quiet. No hum of the heater, no faint buzz of electricity. The power was out. Francesca swung her legs over the side of the couch, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders as she moved toward the window. Outside, the world was buried beneath a thick, untouched layer of snow. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a frozen wasteland. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She hesitated. No one else knew she was here. She crossed the small space quickly, unlocking the door to find Callum standing there, bundled in a heavy coat, snow dusting his shoulders. His breath was visible in the frigid air, and his expression was unreadable as usual. "Power's out," he said. "It wasn't a question. I noticed." He glanced past her into the cabin. "You got enough firewood." She stepped aside, allowing him in without thinking twice. He stomped the snow from his boots before entering, his presence once again filling the space with something solid, something grounding. "I have enough for tonight," she admitted. "But if the power stays out?" "It might," he said. "Storm knocked out a few lines, could be a day, maybe longer." She swallowed hard. Francesca had never been the type to panic, but the thought of being stranded in a powerless cabin for days was not exactly comforting. Callum seemed to sense this. He unzipped his coat, shaking off the last of the snow. "I've got a generator back at my place, enough to keep the essentials running. You should come stay." She stiffened. "I'll be fine here." His gaze didn't waver. "You're not used to this kind of cold. I can handle myself." He exhaled through his nose as if weighing whether arguing with her was worth the effort. "Suit yourself. But if you change your mind, my door's open." She didn't respond, and after a beat, he nodded once before turning toward the door. But before he could step outside, a small voice rang out from the darkness beyond the porch. "Dad." Francesca froze. Callum turned, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. He stepped onto the porch, disappearing into the night for a brief moment, before returning with a small bundle wrapped in a thick coat. A pair of sleepy blue eyes peeked out from beneath a wool hat, blinking up at Francesca curiously. "This is Lily," Callum said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Francesca's mind reeled. She had not expected this. A child. Lily yawned, rubbing at her eyes with mitten-clad hands. "I got cold," she murmured, her words slightly muffled. Callum adjusted her in his arms with practiced ease. "I told you to stay in the truck." She pouted but didn't argue. "Francesca." for the first time in a long time, found herself at a loss for words. She had met countless powerful men, CEOs, investors, politicians, but none of them had ever looked at anyone the way Callum looked at his daughter. Protective, steady, unshakable. Something in her chest tightened. "You should get her inside," Francesca found herself saying, her voice quieter than before. Callum nodded. "Yeah." He hesitated for a moment, then met her gaze with something unreadable before stepping out into the cold, carrying his daughter back to his truck. Francesca stood in the doorway, watching as the taillights disappeared into the snowy night, leaving her with nothing but the crackling embers and a heart pounding far too fast. The next morning, the sky stretched wide and clear, the storm having left behind a breathtaking stillness. Sunlight glinted off the untouched snow, turning the world into a pristine, frozen paradise. But the beauty of it was lost on Francesca as she stood by the window, her thoughts tangled in the memory of Callum and the little girl nestled sleepily in his arms. She had assumed many things about him, but she had never expected this. A father, it changed everything in ways she couldn't quite put into words. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Callum stood there, bundled in his coat, but this time, Lily was with him, her small gloved hand wrapped around his. Francesca's gaze flickered between them. "Figured you might need a ride into town," Callum said. "Roads are clearing, but your car's buried." Lily peered up at Francesca with open curiosity. "You're really pretty." Heat crept up Francesca's neck at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," Callum exhaled through his nose, clearly amused. "Lily." "What?" "She is." Francesca felt an odd tug in her chest, something warm and unfamiliar. She hadn't been around children in years, and certainly not one as effortlessly charming as Lily. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. "Let me grab my coat." As they drove into town, Lily chatted endlessly from the back seat, filling the silence with stories about her school, the snow fort she had built last winter, and how her dad made the best pancakes in the world. Callum didn't interrupt, didn't correct her, just listened, the corners of his mouth twitching when she exaggerated certain details. Francesca watched them from the corner of her eye, something deep inside her softening. When they reached town, Callum pulled up in front of a small diner with a red and white awning. The scent of fresh coffee and warm maple syrup greeted them the moment they stepped inside. The place was cozy, filled with locals who greeted Callum and Lily like old friends. Francesca, however, was met with curious glances. She had spent years commanding rooms full of powerful executives, but for some reason, standing there under the weight of small-town scrutiny made her oddly self-conscious. Callum, as if sensing it, placed a steady hand on the small of her back, guiding her to a booth. The touch was brief, barely there, but it sent warmth curling through her. Lily slid into the seat across from her, swinging her legs as she studied Francesca. "Do you like pancakes?" "I do." "Good." "Dad's are better, but these are still okay." Callum shook his head, but there was a fondness in his expression that made Francesca's chest tighten. The waitress arrived, setting down mugs of steaming coffee. "You're the one renting the old cabin, right?" Francesca nodded. "Figured." "People don't usually come up this way unless they've got a reason." Francesca met Callum's gaze briefly, but he said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. She had come here to escape, to bury herself in solitude until the media storm back home died down. But now, sitting across from a man who saw through her defenses, and a little girl who looked at her like she was something out of a fairy tale, she wasn't so sure solitude was what she wanted anymore. After breakfast, Callum drove her back to the cabin. When they reached the driveway, he put the truck in park but didn't move to open his door. Francesca turned to him, waiting. "You're leaving soon," he said, his voice even. She inhaled sharply. "Yes," he nodded, as if he had already known the answer. "I figured." Lily, still in the back seat, was oblivious to the weight of the conversation unfolding in the front. She hummed to herself, playing with the zipper on her coat. Francesca looked out at the snow-covered cabin, then back at the man beside her. I didn't expect to meet anyone here. Callum's fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel. Neither did I. The silence between them was thick, charged with something unspoken. Lily suddenly leaned forward, resting her arms on the center console. Are you coming back? Francesca's throat tightened. I don't know, she admitted. Lily frowned. I think you should. Callum exhaled slowly, then reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind Francesca's ear, his touch lingering just a second too long. So do I, he said quietly. Francesca's pulse roared in her ears. For the first time in years, she didn't know what came next, but as she stepped out of the truck and watched them drive away, she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to come back. Francesca had never been one to second-guess herself. Every decision, every calculated move in her career had been made with precision. But as she stood in the now warm cabin, staring at the untouched snow outside, she felt something foreign hesitation. The days that followed passed in slow, contemplative moments. The town, small yet full of life, had a way of creeping under her skin. She had ventured into the local grocery store, expecting stares, but instead, she had been met with nods of acknowledgement, as if she had already been accepted in some unspoken way. She had run into Callum once, just a brief moment at the post office where he had been picking up a package. Their eyes had met, but neither had spoken beyond polite greetings. Still, the weight of what had been left unsaid lingered between them like a slow, burning ember. And then there was Lily. The little girl had waved at her from across the street that day, her mitten-clad hand enthusiastically flapping in the air before Callum had gently nudged her along. That small, simple gesture had stayed with Francesca long after they had disappeared from view. Now, as she packed her suitcase, folding the last of her belongings into neat, purposeful stacks, that hesitation lodged itself deeper in her chest. Her time here had been meant as an escape, but it had become something else entirely. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Callum stood there, hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with an expression that was unreadable yet heavy with unspoken words. You really leaving? His voice was steady, but there was something just beneath the surface, something restrained. She tightened her grip on the doorframe. I have to. He nodded once, looking past her into the cabin as if memorizing the space, then back at her. Figured. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time, Francesca found herself wishing he would argue, would push, would demand she stay. But Callum wasn't the kind of man to ask someone to change their course. He was the kind of man who let them choose, and that was the hardest part. She swallowed. Lily, at school, his voice was softer now, less guarded, didn't think saying goodbye would be easy for her. Francesca exhaled slowly, nodding. Callum shifted, glancing away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. You'll go back to your life. To your company, the press, all of it. She hesitated, then said, yes. A muscle in his jaw tightened briefly before he exhaled. You'll do just fine. Something inside her cracked at that. Because she wasn't sure fine was what she wanted anymore. She reached out before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his sleeve. Callum, he didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, his calloused hand covering hers, warm and steady. You don't owe me an explanation, Francesca. But that was the thing she wanted to give one. She took a shaky breath. I don't know how to do this. His lips parted slightly, his gaze searching hers. Do what? She shook her head, frustration curling at the edges of her voice. Stay, leave. Want something I don't even fully understand. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke, voice low but firm. Then figure it out. She blinked up at him, her heart pounding. Callum let go of her hand, stepping back, but there was something in his expression, something that told her he wasn't walking away. He was waiting. And for the first time in her life, Francesca realized she had a choice that wasn't dictated by expectations or obligations. She could leave, or she could stay. The answer came not in a grand revelation, but in the steady, undeniable pull in her chest. She exhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "Callum," he didn't move, but when she spoke again, her voice was clear. "I'm staying." For the first time since she had met him, she saw something shift in his gaze, something raw, something real, and just like that, the hesitation was gone. The decision had been made, but the weight of it settled over Francesca in a way she hadn't anticipated. Staying meant stepping into the unknown, something she had spent her entire life avoiding. It meant facing whatever this was between her and Callum, rather than running back to the safety of her world. For the first time in years, she had no carefully laid out plan. Callum hadn't pressed her for answers after she told him she was staying. He had simply nodded, as though he had known all along that she would. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of quiet certainty, a steadiness that unsettled and reassured her all at once. The town, in its quiet, unassuming way, had already begun to claim her. The people, the rhythm of life here, it was so far removed from the constant noise of New York, yet she found herself drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. She spent the next few days finding her footing, helping out at the small bookstore when the owner, an older woman named Martha, mentioned she needed help reorganizing inventory. The work was simple, but there was something grounding about it, about the smell of old pages, about the way customers lingered over selections, unhurried. Callum showed up one afternoon, leaning against the counter as she sorted through a box of newly arrived novels. She looked up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. "You look like you belong here," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, glancing around the shop. "I don't know about that." His gaze didn't waver. "You do." Something about the certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. Later that evening, she found herself at his house, sitting at the kitchen table as Lily chattered away about school, her small hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Francesca listened, fascinated by the ease with which the little girl moved through conversations, as though she had known Francesca forever. Callum leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between them, something unreadable in his expression. It wasn't until after Lily had gone to bed that he finally spoke. "You're different here." Francesca set down her tea, watching him carefully. "Different how?" He studied her, as though weighing his words. "Less guarded." She exhaled slowly, turning her gaze to the window, where the last remnants of sunset painted the sky in soft gold. "Maybe because there's nothing to guard against here." He was quiet for a long moment before he said, "And when you go back?" She looked at him then, fully meeting his gaze. "What if I don't?" Something shifted between them, something undeniable. Callum didn't speak, didn't move, but she could feel the tension between them, thick and unspoken. She had spent her entire life making decisions based on logic, based on strategy. But this was something entirely different, and for once, she wasn't afraid of it. The days stretched into weeks, and the town slowly became something more than just a temporary escape. It became familiar, became home in a way she hadn't expected. Callum was steady, always there but never pushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give. Yet with every passing day, the space between them grew smaller, until one evening, as they stood outside the cabin beneath a sky littered with stars, he reached for her hand. She let him. His fingers were warm against hers, rough from years of work, yet gentle in a way that made her breath hitch. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She turned toward him, searching his face, seeing the patience, the quiet strength. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the answer. "Yes." And when he leaned in, when his lips met hers in a kiss that was slow and unhurried, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, like him, like them. She had spent so long chasing a version of happiness that had never quite fit. But here, in this quiet town, in the arms of a man who had never asked her to be anything other than who she was, she had finally found it. And she wasn't going anywhere.